never changes. Why is that? And why does Ernest Hemingway seem to ignore it in his book about war? Why is it we see his constant quest for arbitrary masculine definitions? Why is the context of the book in real life demonstrative of this quest extending past the characters in the book? And why does Farewell to Arms make me want to throw it across the room whenever I read it? That is why we're here today, to ask Heming why! We are going to talk about A Farewell to Arms, a very, very, very well-known book in the modernist sphere, in the Great War sense of books. So we've already talked about Generals Die in Bed. You know, we're moving up to like a more well-known option, Farewell to Arms. We're graduating. We were in little piddly elementary school, Great War novels, Generals Die in Bed, and now we're in the big bad kid middle school. So we're just going to give you some context to World War I, some context to Ernest Hemingway himself. Then we're going to talk about the plot of the book. I'm going to go into some spoilers, and then we're just going to talk about some stuff. Okay, so let me read you the thing that I did to write, to tell you. World War I began in the late summer of 1914. Europe was left to fight this battle on their own, all sides drawing their fullest potential of their colonial reaches in order to overpower one another. As the years wore on and the Western powers found themselves in a bitter stalemate, the strain of the war started having effects on the industrial and economic might that the European powers once had. America, once seen as a strong but more diminutive power, saw for the first time its swell in importance and power on the global stage. The Germans knew that wherever America threw its weight would decide the war, and America had been making it pretty clear that they had been clandestinely supporting British and French war efforts throughout the years. European allies also knew how determinative of a force America would be on the ground, and they attempted to convince America to join to no avail. It was not until the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a civilian ship that had probably been retrofitted to smuggle weapons to the British anyway, by German submarines, as well as a plot wherein the German intelligence allegedly attempted to get Mexico to declare war on America, just to create a distraction from the juggernaut from joining in Europe. It wasn't until those two things happened that public support in America shifted, and America decided that it would go to war in 1917, and eventually win the war against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire in 1918. America's relatively unscathed and victorious contribution to the Great War fueled the ego of the nation, the likes of which, frankly, still continues to this day. America was like an important country, but like was not as important as Britain and France and Germany. After World War I, it was like, damn, America number one. America number one. So it fueled the ego of the nation, and from that ego poured the greatest wealth of finance, technology, and culture the world had ever known. And of course, in that torrential wave, Hemingway stands like a giant. A young man born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois, outside of Chicago, Ernest Hemingway, much like many young men at that time, found it en vogue to enlist in the armed forces. Ernest, however, was rejected from service. Now, of a point of the man in general, and in this book in question, masculinity is valued very much by Ernest, especially in his hormone-stricken younger years. He would have been like in his late teens by World War I. The U.S. military was, of course, no obstacle for Ernest, and he enlisted to become an ambulance driver for the Red Cross in Italy. He arrived in Paris in May 1918, was witness to brutal carnage in June, and was severely wounded in July. Despite his wounds during a mortar attack, Ernest displayed great courage in helping the other wounded and was awarded the Silver Medal for Military Valor from the from the Italian military. While recovering from his injuries, Ernest met and fell in love with a British nurse who was several years his senior. Obsessed with her, he returned home to put his life in order, to go back and be with her, where she sent him a letter that broke his heart. She told him she did not reciprocate his feelings for her, and that he was in fact too immature. At this point, he was literally 18 or 19 or something like that. There's a lot to say about Ernest post-World War I, and there are many other people who have greater depth in his life and times, but this heartbreak was undoubtedly influential on his next several works, his relationships, and how he exuded himself in his private and public life. Ernest worked as a journalist for the Toronto Star, basing himself out of Paris. While there, he penned many of his early works, among them his first critical and commercial hit, A Farewell to Arms. That's the subject of this video. Like many war books being published in the late 1920s, Farewell was ripe with controversy. The book depicts violence, excessive alcoholism, and premarital sex, all of which contributed to describing this book at the time as pornographic. Despite this label, or maybe attracting the interest because of this label, Mr. Hemingway found himself to be a literary powerhouse, exploded in cultural consideration, and that continued well into his life and beyond past his death. Okay, so we're going to talk about the book now. So there's going to be, I'm going to just talk about shit that happens in the book. I am going to make a note of the big spoilers. Those of you who have read this book, there is the obvious big spoiler. This book doesn't really rely on a whole lot. It's quite interesting. Before we talk about it, before I go into it, the last video I did, we talked about modernism, and I was on a quest to kind of explain modernism a little bit better. The more I learn about modernism, the less I understand of it. So we're going to go with the same kind of definition we had, very concise writing, very literal topics, and trying to be as truthful and non-flowery. There's no euphemism, right? Euphemism is gone in modernism. If it's there, it's ironic, or it's to serve an example, right? It's if there's euphemism or metaphor, it's to put a spotlight on something. So we'll talk about the plot of this book. So A Farewell to Arms is a fictionalized biographical account of Ernest's time in World War I. The most obvious editorial change that the book makes from reality, the biggest deviation, is that the British nurse in the book actually reciprocates the protagonist's love in an almost fairy tale fashion, albeit a little more pornographic than Rapunzel. We follow the life of young Henry, an American serving as an officer ambulance driver for the Italians. Henry is a bit of a party animal who couldn't give much of a fuck of what's going on around him. He has his friends, he has his job, and he looks for any earthly pleasure he can. While he enjoys his ability to take time off and tour Italy, as well as enjoy his authority over his Italian ambulance drivers, as well as a cozy and comparatively private living quarters, Henry does get to experience some of the brutal realities of the war. Before a planned offensive, he meets a British nurse named Catherine. They share flirtations and spend their free time together. They bond over loss and being quite alone as foreigners protecting a foreign land. When it is time for the offensive to occur, we see Henry robotically commanding his ambulance drivers to the front. A mortar attack strikes, and Henry's leg is badly injured. A stoic trip across Italy for the injured Henry has him wind up in Milan. Doctors are unsure of how his leg will heal, but a loose cannon surgeon offers Henry the quickest recovery, and Henry chooses that. After surgery, a happy coincidence happens. Catherine arrives at the very hospital Henry is bedridden in. As Henry mends his leg, he puts the moves on Catherine, much to the chagrin of her prudish colleagues. But their love is so intense and pure that they seem to get the blessing of all the Italians around them, those Italians who Henry regularly criticizes for their predisposition for love and relaxation rather than war. Henry soaks up his time, bored though he is. For a young man who must wait all day for the few precious moments to be private with the woman he loves, Henry kills time the way we kill brain cells, with copious, absurd amounts of alcohol. One of the good themes of the book here. A little drink. Not liquor, but if I was Henry, it would be. Months pass, and Henry, for his valor, is awarded 3 weeks of leave before being assigned back to the front. To celebrate this, and now the pregnancy of Catherine, He plans to steal Catherine away to make the most of his 3 weeks. But it comes to pass that his indulgences have gotten the better of him. His alcoholism leads to jaundice, and Henry is accused of intentionally making himself ill to avoid returning back to the front. Henry's alleged cowardice is punished, and his 3 weeks is taken away from him. Back at the front, the Allies suffer much like Henry's heart. They are given orders for a massive retreat. Henry must lead his men and ambulances through the chaos. A couple of misguided and mistaken turns slow their progress until they find themselves behind enemy lines. Henry's mistake costs lives. And even when they meet their fellow Italians, the whole retreat was bungled so badly that the brazen young men have taken upon themselves to execute the shameful officers responsible. Henry, an officer, narrowly escapes death, but now, having abandoned his post, is now a deserter. If he is ever found out, he is to die. With the help of friends, Henry's able to smuggle himself to see Catherine yet again. Without much convincing, she agrees to leave the country and settle in their new life free in neutral Switzerland. From this point on, I'll be mentioning the spoilers, the big spoiler. So be warned, if you want to read the book, it's pretty fun. It's a pretty fun read. You get to see kind of like the casualness of like life in Italy, like what you think the European continental chill life is, mixed with like institutionalized warfare where everyone's like finding any opportunity to drink and nap, but also like fuck, we gotta like survive kind of thing. It's fun and it's funny, and particularly like it's not funny, but like Henry's alcoholism is kind of funny, just the absurd excess of it. He just like, when he's in the hospital and he's just drinking like bottles upon bottles of wine a day, and he just has like his friends, like the orderlies and shit, sneak it out. It's just funny, kind of. It's sad, but it is funny. But anyway, we're going to talk about the big spoilers of the book. So, before I talk about it, we're going to kind of start framing the book the way I think the book should be framed. This book is nothing but about self-interest. Henry is but a neuron looking for stimulus, and he takes it wherever he can find it. I think this is, of course, commenting on, when we're talking about Great War literature, the lost generation, where kids raised in romanticism, disillusioned by mechanized industrial warfare, right? So he's just looking for stimulus anywhere he can. But salvation is purported to lie in the heart. I'm interpreting the twist to have, and we'll get to the twist, to have some sort of commentary on the past romantic age that Ernest Hemingway would have come from. He would have been raised in. The book shows a young man who sees nothing but war, whose only pastime is drink, but eventually he finds what is meaningful love. Still departing from tradition, the love is not blessed by family or the church, but there is still something pure about finding comfort in someone's tender soul in perhaps the most soulless age that had ever been up until that point. A more romantic story would end happily ever after, Henry abandoning his position and living on the run, swooping Catherine off her feet to go start their family in a magical oasis in the Alps. It is an idyllic dream, so the only thing that could go wrong is that it's brought all back to reality. And of course, in the modern tradition, it blows in like a hurricane. So the big spoiler, it happens in the last few fucking pages. It's a traumatic read, so if you haven't read it and you don't mind spoilers, Catherine dies. She dies, she gives birth, and the baby dies, and she dies. And Henry just deals with it. He just takes the pain, like another injury, like his leg, and just limps on back to a hotel. So, Henry survives war, he survives mutiny, he survives love, and he survives loss. So what is this book about? Like I said, it's about self-interest, but I think in a more meta sense. So take a step back, look at how this book unfolds versus what happened in real life. Henry falls in love, the love is reciprocated, but life gets in the way, and Henry has nothing. Anything that he has is now gone. Look at Ernest's life. He thinks he's found love. It's very one-sided. Apparently, like, they never, like, did the do. They didn't bump uglies, this British nurse. he was like 18 or 19. I think she was like 26 at the time. So it's just kind of like, he's still going through puberty. She was like a grown up, and she just kind of cuts it off. So Ernest must have felt really powerless, because I think he was back in Oak Park, or maybe his family had been moved to Kansas at that time. But anyway, he was just back in America, and he just gets a letter saying like, oh, by the way, like, you're a fucking maniac. I don't love you. I'm gonna marry someone else. So just eat a dick and don't come back for me. That's probably hurts just as bad. But I think we can take a look at Ernest's reaction to the events based on like Henry's reaction to the death of Catherine. So in the book, the baby is born, and it becomes clear that there are complications, and like Henry vocalizes like he doesn't care about the baby, he just cares about Catherine. So he doesn't like care about life, he doesn't care about love, he doesn't care about the culmination of love, right? Like ideally in a more romantic situation, you could have the conflict of like, oh, the mother dies, but you know, her memory will live on in our baby, right? Like, I will not forget you kind of thing. But Henry's just literally like, fuck the kid, like throw it away, I don't give a shit, like how's Catherine doing? And then the baby dies, and then she dies, and everyone dies, and then he has nothing. So when I talk about self-interest, that's kind of what I mean. If I'm looking at the context of the book Farewell to Arms in terms of like lost generation, modernism, and Great War literature, where like Eric Remarque's book or Generals Die in Bed, the last video I did, where they're kind of talking about like general ideas of what the war is and what it did, and like kind of like the cultural sins that industrial war was for these people at the time who like never thought of it before. That's like not a consideration for Ernest Hemingway. He's like really selfish. He doesn't care about any, like the main character's decisions in the book literally cause innocent people to die. Now they're not necessarily bad decisions. Ernest is kind of giving the portrayal that this is a young man. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? He's just thrown in these horrible situations, and he makes a choice, and it has negative consequences. So that's like when he's in combat and war. But he doesn't spend much time talking about it. He like literally will mention like, damn, I feel like some regret that guy died. But he doesn't think about it ever again. He just reacts to like things that matter to him. So he's happy when he finds wine. He eats food when people scrounge up, when they steal shit from people's houses. They find a bed during their retreat and stuff like that. He is happy to love Catherine, but he's not really happy to not have Catherine and like have a kid, right? Like he just wants what he wants. And I think, I don't know if Hemingway is commenting on this, but I think he's just demonstrating that like that kind of disillusionment of like romanticism, where war was like, come on man, let's go to battle, we shall charge and have honor and we'll have a good time, and it's boys being boys and have a good time, to like sniveling and cowering and infection and rot and rain and mud. Like it's just like not good at all. Like war was never good, but culture before World War I was really like king and country, man, like go for it, there's honor in what you're doing, you can have respect after the fact. And this was the time where everyone was like, there's not really any honor and there's not really any respect. So rather than using the book Farewell to Arms to kind of turn the mirror and show society like, this is what the war was, this is why we're all alcoholics, this is why we hate like all the institutions that led to like the greatest carnage ever, Hemingway in fact like just kind of turns the mirror on himself, and he's kind of like pitying himself and the time he has, and he doesn't really think about anyone else. Okay, so we're gonna start on the kind of like analysis of the book. Now, I apologize for my disorganized perspective. This is the book. It's kind of a chunk, kind of like not, the pages aren't bad, it's easy to read. The plot is very aimless, and it made me disorganized for anything to say. I think that's sort of the point, but let's kind of talk about that. Nothing happens. And I think that's a thing for all great war literature, is that like, you know, the Great War was such a shock. If you're in the context of a soldier, you kind of grew up with all that romantic era stuff, like king and country, honor, valor, go to war, you'll be loved forever, you're doing something for the greater good. The greater good is serving your country. And then you go into this like super sterile, very objective context of industrialized war where effort and faith and heart just don't matter at all. They're just like, maybe they're factors when you're dealing with swords and shit like that. When you're surrounded by people who are just beating each other to death, maybe you having the will and might and just the courage is will make up the difference for you to survive and win the battle. But when you're talking about like artillery, where they're just like, here's the line, just aim for that. It could hit anyone. It could hit the most patriotic. It could hit the most virtuous person. It could hit the person who is the least deserving of carnage and like torture them until they die. So the plot is not going to be about anything. I don't know if that's necessarily a conclusive thing. I'm just saying, like, that's the perspective that these writers have, where like you have this disassociation, where romanticism, you have a plot, you have a quest for honor, you do A, you do B to get C, right? And C is usually honor or like a beautiful woman, something like that. You slay the dragon, you do the thing, and then you get the stuff, right? Now these people, there's like no point to waking up in the morning. There's no point to even fighting anyone, because you go do an offensive and then you gotta retreat, and then you do an offensive, then you gotta retreat, and then you move somewhere else, and you do the same thing over and over and over again. It just sucks, right? Like there's no, it's so aimless. And so the plot of Farewell to Arms is kind of like that, where it's just like there's no objective, just shit happens. Henry is like in the ocean, and the waves are like going like this, and he's lost, and then he finds a little like inflatable tube, and it's Catherine, and he's like holding on to it for dear life, but then it gets worse and she gets torn away, and then he's like still alone in the sea, right? Like that's what the story is. That would be the metaphor of the plot, is like just shit happens, something good sort of happens, and then it goes away, right? Like Henry doesn't do anything other than be selfish, and then yeah. So if I were to to analyze this book, I honestly, the best way for me is to like frame it like, so I'm gonna imagine I'm in university or high school or something like that, and someone assigns me Farewell to Arms to read. They say, read this book, write a paper on it. The standout thing for me is the self-interest that Henry has. How like he doesn't care about his kid being born. He just cares that he's like losing the woman he loves. He doesn't care about people getting shot because of his like mistakes. He's like, will mention it. He doesn't care about the priests who are actually like looking out for his best interest. He just doesn't care. It's all about him. You know, I think that would be a good way to like take a look, especially. Okay, we're going to take a look at the American perspective post-World War I, and I think this is a good one because Ernest Hemingway is like the American guy. So, like honestly, for people at the time, and then like just the effects on history of literature in general, like there's kind of no one better to like use Ernest Hemingway's perspective as kind of like the microcosm of the American perspective post-World War I, and contrast it to a European perspective. I think a really good one to contrast this book would be All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque. Now I haven't done an actual video on it. I would like to eventually. It's kind of the crown jewel, from what I can gather of people's reaction to it online. If you're talking Great War literature, All Quiet on the Western Front is like the most insightful. It has the most to say. It is commenting on just industry, politics, and like the social effects of the public, of the military, and of veterans, right? Like it is a very in-depth war, and I think if you were to contrast those two, the American perspective and the Europeans, you could kind of take a look at kind of like the criticism of America of like its role in World War I, arguably World War II as well, where, so I like America. My accent, my culture, I am pro-allies in both World War I and World War II. I don't want to sound like I'm overly critical of America's role, and I don't want to sound overly apologetic of America or the Allies in general. I'm just saying, I'm glad America helped out. But if I am to criticize America in World War I and World War II, if I were a European, I would say, why the fuck didn't you do anything earlier? Right? America has had a very, very privileged position. So over the 19th century, it industrialized in a very similar capacity as Europe. But where Europe was they're basically the same genetic people. It's just a small area, relatively small. So Europe's big, but like all these different cultures and ethnicities exist crammed together, right? So when war breaks out, they're going to be hurting each other in the way that's best, in like psychological warfare. It's the same thing that you do for Pearl Harbor. You know, you shock America to submission. If you're Germany, you shock France into submission. You bomb towns, you hurt civilians, you make the war unpopular, you fuck them up, right? And it's easy to do that in Europe when you have enemies. When you're America and you basically own Canada, like what the fuck is Canada gonna do? They need you. And like Mexico is also like not really a threat. Like you look at America in the 20th century, as a history in general, the biggest threats to America that have existed were literally America itself, the Confederacy and the Civil War, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That's been the biggest like threats that they've had. You know, Japan and Pearl Harbor, obviously like horrible stuff there. But I mean like America proper, like its people, its industry, its economy never ever had to suffer the way the European industry and people had to suffer. So, I think it's kind of interesting if you look at a book like All Quiet on the Western Front, the reaction of the writer, of Eric Remarque, who experienced World War I, and you know, part of the book is him going home and being very close to the front lines and seeing life there, is like taking the mirror, like I said, and saying, we cannot do this ever again. This World War I is unacceptable, right? That's what he's doing with the book. He's like, look at how much we lost. Look at who we lost. We did this for no purpose, right? That's the point of the book. And you look at the timing of all the great war books, right? They're coming out in the late 20s. Hitler is becoming an agitator. Early 20s, Germany is getting beat down economically, and it's attractive for Hitler to come and start the recovery process. So, you know, if you look at the history books, like people were aware Hitler would be a problem for like a long time before World War II broke out. So it's no coincidence when you look at the timing of all the publishing of these books in the late 20s and early 30s, like they're commenting on like, let's avoid another world war at all costs, right? Now Hemingway, he's like looking like, hey, there's all these books about Great War. I want to cash in on that. I was in the Great War. I'm going to sell my experience. But rather than the other Great War writers who are like, we can't do this. This was really, really bad. Like, everyone lost in this. Hemingway takes them here and is like, oh man, war sucked. I got an ouchie on my leg and I didn't get laid. Ugh. You know, I don't mean to diminish his role and responsibility, and he did good things. He was a brave person. I'm not denying that at all. I'm just saying, like, the way the book writes itself, the war doesn't fucking matter. He doesn't think about the war. He doesn't think about the effects of the war. It's just his self-interest. And maybe that's an example of an effect of the war you could talk about, that, you know, you experience war and then you realize like, oh, death can happen randomly at any time. Therefore, I'm just going to be driven by self-interest. I'm just going to do the things I want to do. But he's not commenting on that. He's just kind of demonstrating it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just doing it. And it's just, you take a step back and kind of look at the spheres of opinion on combat and industrialized war. The European side seems to be more like, not again. And America's just like, whatever, it can happen again. It just is a bummer. That's kind of what I would write about if I were writing a paper. Just contrasting those, the American ego and privilege post-World War I. You could talk about masculinity and femininity and sexism. That is a hot topic for Hemingway. His toxic masculinity is like, of course, it's really, really obvious. A lot of people like to criticize his sexist writing of female characters. You look at this, Catherine's obviously like she's a surrogate of like the perfect girlfriend. She's like, she has no attachments to family. She like likes Henry more than her friends. She trusts and listens to him above anyone else in her life. She's like down to hook up premaritally in a pornographic way. And she's just down for anything Henry says. And, you know, a lot of people have said, oh, that's sexist. And honestly, it is. But I think it's coming more from a place of like Hemingway being like actually heartbroken and like looking to cope in any way he can. But he's like caught up in the masculine culture and probably his own his own neuroses, where he's like, how do I be a man? Well, I just drink and write and party and hunt and shoot and go boating and shit like that. Like, that's how I do it. That's how you be a man, without like identifying anything about what made him the way he was. So you can talk about him being sexist, but I really think, like, especially this book in the context of his other books, like the book he did before this, The Sun Also Rises, his first book, has perhaps one of the most interesting multi-dimensional characters like ever. Personally, I think Lady Brett Ashley is like really interestingly written. Like, Hemingway was very, very generous with what female identity was. Like, it's really good. And so, like, to say that Hemingway is a sexist writer in Farewell to Arms, this would be good evidence of it if you were to like look at other books. But I think in the context of like chronologically, this comes right after him being the most generous. So I think this is not him being sexist. This is just him being an injured little boy who wishes that the girl he loved him back. That's more it. And so I personally wouldn't write about that unless you were going to look at lots of other Hemingway books to kind of see a pattern of behavior. And I think that pattern definitely cements itself in his later years. He becomes a very jaded person. He has marriages kind of out of convenience. If you were to like just even peruse his Wikipedia page, there's like lots of movies about all the relationships he's had. He marries someone, it's fine for a while, then he goes and does something, and then fuck them, on to the new one. So yeah, if I were to write a paper, I would contrast the European and American reactions post World War I. You could talk about the sexist writing. I probably wouldn't. But anyway, I hope you like this video, guys. I'm sorry I put it out so late. I had been intending to do this in November. And I'd like to talk about my future plans for the next couple videos. So I'm filming this in February. I would love to do kind of a Black History literature celebration. I don't want to focus on any one book. There's two books in particular I want to talk about, and actually a couple movies. I'm probably not going to be able to read the books because they're pretty dense and pretty big. So I'm going to just refresh myself and kind of talk about them, and less analysis and more like explain like why it's like a good read and more of a recommendation, and then talk about a couple movies and talk about like me and my white privilege and where I'm from and how these works kind of made me realize and be aware of that privilege and the Black experience. So I'm going to do a video on that. I'm probably not going to get it done in time for the end of February, so it's not going to be part of Black History Month, but trust me, I'm working on it in Black History Month. But before then, I'm going to do another video on another modernist book. It's going to be a shorter book. So Farewell to Arms and Generals Die in Bed, I've read many times. They're some of my favorite books. This book I'm going to do next, I've never read before, but I've heard is a really, really good example of modernism in writing. So I think this book kind of fucked me up in that I became really disorganized in my analysis of modernism based on the lack of plot. I guess it just messed me up. I'm going to try and have a more concise definition of modernism and kind of talk about the genre more, because I love modernists. That's like my favorite, or modernism is my favorite type of literature, I guess, to read. But the most intriguing is postmodernism, which happened next after modernism. So I have like a little library of books from 1890 to like 1950, as well as a postmodern library of like then on. And so I'd like to understand modernism and then understand how it was flipped into postmodernism eventually. So with that, I'm going to end the video, but I'm going to ask if you like what I'm doing. Please leave a suggestion of like another modernist book or another postmodern book, or really any other genre if you are just kind of curious about my take on it. Sorry, I burped. I'd love to. I enjoy doing this. It gives me an opportunity to read, and I hope this encourages at least one other person to read. But yeah, I'll hopefully see you real soon. I'll get this other couple projects going right away. And then if you've seen any of my other videos, I'm kind of working on some other things. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. And thank you very much for watching.